This is Donald A. Coon Jr., Donald Aldrich Coon Jr., and I have with me a tape recorder that number 3 son Larry, after hearing multiple stories and not being able to keep track of all of them, got me this machine and said, "Dad, put some of these things down on tape so we and grandchildren and future generations can listen to some of the good and screwy things that you did when you were growing up." And so we'll begin by telling you that this is the second tape that I've put in, because the first tape that I put in, as I read the directions, and as you all know, I'm not an electronic genius, I was advised that if I wanted to tape side A and then automatically have the machine transfer my future talking to side B, press this and do this and whatever have you. Well, I did. I talked for quite a while. I then tried to replay it, and for some reason or another, my inadequacies mainly, I had part A's and part B's all mixed together. So there is a tape that's not to my liking, so we'll start over again. And I find there's a little spot on here called pause. So when I am trying to think of a name or a place or whatever have you, I can pause and then go back to it without having to keep track of the spot on the tape where I finished up. In addition to my own notes that I'm trying to check out, Larry also said, "Dad, leave some room on each one of the tapes as you cover different periods, because you'll think of something afterwards that you failed to remember or wanted to add, and rather than added it in side 4, you'll be able to go back to number 1 or whatever and insert it there." When I think what helped to prompt Larry to do this or request that I do it was twofold. One, I think of Mr. Kane at Kenmore East, I think a social studies teacher, requested that Larry and other students interview someone older in their family, if they were still around, to get information from what it might have been at the turn of the century or in the teens and 20s and 30s. And he did that. And he made a tape, and I think he had about 50 questions on this sheet that he had that the folks were able to use a tape recorder similar to this, I guess, and read the question and give the answer. And there were items on that tape that were revealing to me, because even though I knew of some of the things, I wasn't sure on dates, places, or what have you. So that was quite a help also. As I continue to tape, I think for clarity reasons, I will try to use, instead of mom and dad or gram and gramps or that type of thing, because obviously mother and father and 2 sets of grandparents and so on, it will be somewhat confusing to whoever's listening to this as to who mom and dad were and gram and gramps. So maybe I'll attempt to insert their proper names, so it'll make it easier for you to understand. In proper names, my mother and father were Donald Aldrich Coon, and as soon as he had me, I think he added senior to it. I don't think it was obviously there prior. My mother was Marion Gertrude Perkins until she married my dad. My dad's parents were Joseph Mulford Coon and my grandmother, his wife, was Mary Ann Scudder. Let's see. On the maternal side, my grandmother's name was Mary Jenny Perkins. And her second husband, well, she was married once previously also. And my grandfather's name was Frank Clinton Perkins. And then a whole raft of folks, as you'll notice in the genealogy charts that I had made up, that may drive you a little bit crazy trying to figure out who, when, what, and where, but there are dates there, and rather than go into all of that previous material, that you'll find in the books that I gave each one of my sons and grandsons for their use or lack of use or non-use or whatever. I'll try to begin by saying that I, at this point in my life, approaching 75, that I wish now that I had paid a lot more attention to things that my mother, mainly my mother, told me about our background. I wish I had paid more attention, had jotted them down. And a lot of these I'm doing from memory. But as I say, I wish that I had paid more attention, and maybe it'll make it easier for you folks, whoever's listening to this, to understand some of the things that occurred from I'll go back to a little bit back to the parents and grandparents and bring you up to speed, and then get into some of the nice and some of the screwy things that I did while I was growing up. A great deal of this began, and ironically, began in England, because as the charts will have you see, not only my paternal but also maternal, and my wife Betty Jane's family all came from England. I did request of a exchange student that we had, Bobby Jack, at one point, to send me maps of England, and those are in the pictorial and albums that are downstairs, and I tried to highlight where the different families came from. And of course, as you're probably all aware, as far as the beginnings in the United States, it occurred on the Mayflower, when our families, I guess, for religious freedom and ability to worship as they pleased, got on the Mayflower. Two of the people were John Alden, who was born around 1599, it says on the chart, so let's say 1600, and he lived until 1687, so he was about 88 years old. Not quite sure when Priscilla Mullins, the lady that he married, when she was born, but probably sometime after he, and she died in 1650. And even though I don't have her date of birth or year of birth, I do find that Elizabeth Alden, their daughter, was born in 1624. So let's make an assumption here that they got married when they're in their early 20s. Not sure what date, but it doesn't make an awful lot of difference. But Elizabeth Alden was born in 1624. And the rest of the clan continued from there, as you'll see in the charts downstairs. And subsequently, this Elizabeth Alden married a William Peabody, who had Lydia Peabody, who married Daniel Grinnell. This is up through the late 1600s and into the 1700s. They had a son by the name of Peabody Grinnell, who married Sarah Barnes, and they had Jonathan Grinnell, and many of these families had more than one child. But I'm just looking from the chart that many of you have up at your wall. This Jonathan Grinnell married Judith Waterhouse, and I'll bring that name up again. And they had a young late girl in 1790 by the name of Wealthy Grinnell, who married John Perkins Sr. They had Jarvis Perkins, who married Lydia Ann Blood, and they two, Jarvis and Lydia Blood, had Frank C. Perkins, among others, his brothers and sisters, and I'll get to those things later. And as a second marriage, married Mary Jenny Cooper. I rather suspect that Jarvis Perkins was a resident of Dunkirk or somewhere in that vicinity, because I do know that Lydia Ann Blood, their family had a funeral home in the Dunkirk area, known as the Blood Funeral Home. And I believe that Jarvis Perkins was the owner and distributor for buggy whips, leather horse paraphernalia, straps, and I'm not familiar with all the types of things that you'd use in retaining or guiding a horse, but leather goods. When Douglas, my younger brother, heard about a lot of this and knew himself of some of the history of our ancestors and or Dunkirk, attempted, because he used to drive up to Dunkirk on occasions, and he tried to get the locals up there to dig into some of their historical records so that he could get a copy of Perkins and Blood's and whatever have you information. And they all said, well, it's in the attic of the firehouse, and it's way, way, way in the back, and number one, it's either too hot up there or too cold, so no, we can't get it for you, Doug. So we went without that source of information. Whether it's still there or whether the place has been borne down or they threw it all in the dump, we don't have any idea. But that was a source that couldn't be investigated. Now, I'll try not to veer too far off the path that I would like to take you on by interjecting things that might be pertinent or should be discussed at a future time, and hopefully I won't forget to add them to each one of the tapes. But when you reach this age, memory isn't your strongest suit. So I'll do what I can. Why don't I start with my father's family and then go on to my mother's. Joseph Coon, Joseph Mulford, M-U-L-F-O-R-D, Coon, was born in 1874. And I'm sure that the location of his birth, which I suspect was probably around the Troy area, Troy or Albany area, and for anybody that's interested can look in the book and find out exactly where it was if interested. He married my grandmother, Mary Ann Scudder, S-K-U-D-D-E-R. She was born a year before he in 1873. And she, like he, lived in the Troy area. And again, I'm advised, because of Larry's questions of Don and Marion, my mother and father, that Joseph Coon was employed by a railroad. I've been looking through some of my notes here to find out what the name of the railroad was that he worked for, but it doesn't make an awful lot of difference. He was, after working for the railroad for some time, was transferred. He was a ticket agent for the railroad and was transferred to Buffalo. And a rather humorous aside to that, they packed all their things, I guess, and moved to Buffalo. And the end of the line was what we called at the time the DL&W station, which was right down at the foot of Main Street. And as they departed the train station and walked up Main Street, I've heard that my grandmother, Mary Ann, made the comment, gee, I didn't realize that we came here on a holiday. Because here was a young couple who came here in about 1910 or 1911, which would have made my father about 10 or 11 because he was born in 1901 in Troy. But her comment was, gee, this must be a holiday because coming from a small town of Troy, she had never seen that many people on the street on a weekday, maybe on a weekend, but not on a weekday. So she has made the assumption that it was a holiday because so many people in the normal course of business and shopping and whatever have you were walking on Main Street. Joseph and Mary probably lived in different locations. One of them was on Bird Avenue over on the west side of Buffalo. He continued working for the railroad here until they dispensed with his position. Through a friend, he was able to secure a job for the Dole Packing Company. Again, Buffalo being an end station with railroads and or lake boats for not only wheat but also meats and whatever have you, similar to Chicago. And he was running the office. He was the office man. Joseph Coon was very active in the Masonic order, as was my grandmother, Mary Ann. Mary Ann was very active in the counterpart of the Masonic order, the Eastern Star. You'll find that in the material downstairs that my grandmother, Mary Ann, was elected to or promoted to matron of her Eastern Star chapter, the Salome chapter, as I recall. And in order to make sure everything ran well, or some part of the resolution or constitution or whatever have you of Eastern Star, is that a third-degree Mason, which my grandfather, my father, and I were all, had to attend the meetings and guide the ladies where they needed guidance. And Joseph was the patron for his wife Mary Ann's matron position in the Eastern Star. He was well liked, not just well liked, he was loved by all the ladies, and I think there's a dedication and whatever have you material downstairs in reference to him and to her for the work that they did running that organization for a year. I think Joseph Coon, my grandfather, walked with a limp. And it's my understanding, through my dad, as I can recall it, that the way he received got his hip thrown out of joint was that, as boys will do, they pick each other up by the arms or legs and swing them around or whatever have you, and they did this to young Joseph, and his hip got thrown out. Well, medicine being what it was back in the late 19th or early 20th century, didn't know how to handle this sort of thing, so I guess his hip was out of joint for the rest of his life and walked with a pretty perceivable limp. Unfortunately, he died when he was like 53 years old in 1927, actually 1 year after my parents, Marion and Don, were married. I believe that my dad, Don's mother, Mary Ann, lived with my parents for a short period of time until she, through her brother, Ernie Scudder, who lived in Little Falls, New York, and I think was a machinist in some capacity like that, lived in Little Falls and knew of an elderly lady, widow, fairly well-to-do, who needed someone to move in, live in, and take care of her needs. And at what point she left Buffalo and went to Little Falls, I don't know the answer to. But anyhow, she lived there for quite some time. And I think lived there until, I think either Ernie or her brother passed away, and she moved back to Buffalo. I'll talk about a trip that I made up to Little Falls sometime later to visit Graham. She did at some point move back to Buffalo, maybe when the lady died and didn't need her services anymore. And she got a job at the wheelchair home. And the wheelchair home at that time was located at the corner of Kenmore Avenue and Delaware Avenue in one of two residences, the Eberhardt brothers, founders or initial people in the village of Kenmore, built two identical homes, one next to each other. The second one, made out of stone, is still there and is currently occupied by a financial institution. But Marianne worked at the wheelchair home as a practical nurse. She didn't have, I don't know if she had any nursing abilities other than taking care of this lady in Little Falls. She didn't have a practical nurse's degree, I don't think. She may have, but she was not a registered nurse. And she lived there and took care of these older ladies who lived in the Schofield residence. And she'd come over to our house for, dinner or occasions, and I would try to get over there and see her. That building has since been raised and was raised when, 20, 30 years later, they built a new facility out on Elmwood Avenue, a wheelchair home. In fact, Ray Sinclair and I were the co-chairman of a fundraising event, and it was done during my year as president, so that was in 1981. So that was 25 years ago. Grandma Coon finally reached a point. I don't think she wanted anybody to know what her age was, but as long as she was capable, she continued working at the wheelchair home. There came a time when she either couldn't work anymore, or it was time to apply for Social Security benefits, and trying to reconstruct the incomes that she had to make a determination as to what her benefits would be. God bless the people at Social Security, because after she told them what she earned, either in Little Falls or in Buffalo or whatever have you, some kind soul said, well, where did you live? Well, I lived right there. Well, the lady said, well, part of your income that you earned as room and board, since you didn't have to pay it, it was provided for you, has to be added to your income to provide a higher benefit. So they were very gracious in helping Graham to receive whatever she received as Social Security benefit. And it was about this time in the mid-50s, 56, 57, when Mom and Dad didn't have the facilities to let Grandma move in with them at 720 Parkhurst. So they looked around for another house and found one on the corner of Clark and Delaware Road that was made basically a one-floor plan, but did have up over the garage a facility for a in-law or what have you. So that's where Grandma moved, was up a set of stairs that had a kitchen, a bathroom, and a large, a bedroom and a living room. And she lived there with Mom and Dad, Don and Marion, until it was required that it was absolutely necessary for her to move into a nursing home. Another aside, my mother, Marion, enjoyed cooler temperatures, be it during the summer, winter, whenever have you. And so my mother, Marion, was in charge of setting the thermostat. Well, I guess the thermostat also controlled the facilities above the garage, and with my mother keeping the temperature low, poor Graham was in sweaters and slacks and long underwear and whatever have you, trying to stay warm. And of course, at her age, her circulation wasn't as good as my mother's was. So she didn't freeze to death, but she was an uncomfortable elderly lady. And poor Dad either didn't want to, or whatever have you, put insulation in the ceiling of the garage to to keep things up there a little bit warmer. I think they did have heating units and or one of those wall units that helps to throw heat out. That's just an aside. Now let me attempt to get back to my maternal side. Excuse me. As I mentioned, Frank Perkins was born and raised in Dunkirk. That was a harness shop that I was referring to before, where they made buggy whips and harnesses for horses, and I couldn't think of the terminology at the time. Frank C. Perkins, Frank Clinton Perkins, was my grandfather, and he had 4 or 5 brothers and sisters. And for anyone interested, you can look in the chart. No, you don't have to look in the chart. I just did. He had an older sister, Clarissa, born in 1862. Lillian, born in 1866. He, Frank, being born in 1867. And Carrie, born in 1870, and an Eveline Perkins, who was born in 1878. Some of their pictures that are in, again, pictorial books downstairs are pictures of Eveline, I think, and others. Carrie Perkins stayed in Dunkirk. She was a maiden lady, very good size as I recall, but I think she taught school in Dunkirk until she passed away. Frank was a pretty good student, and I don't recall whether he paid for or was given a scholarship to Cornell University, where he became a student in electrical engineering, and I believe graduated in probably 1890, something like that, and put together a book, a hardcover book, a copy of which is downstairs, which depicted the buildings there at Cornell, a full page on each one of the professors, I believe, more in his area, his department, excuse me, and I guess sold ads, so this might have been done in 1891, somewhere in that vicinity, sold ads to various businesses in the Dunkirk and Buffalo area, including consulting firm ads for his own businesses. Looking through the book, you'll see Frank C. Perkins Enterprise and electrical consulting and whatever have you. In addition, in some of the pictorial books downstairs, you'll see, I don't think it was on Lake Erie at Dunkirk, but I think it maybe Chautauqua Lake. It was either a float or a raft of some kind, with very, very large signs around it, Frank C. Perkins, electrical engineer, type of thing. So he was in the business of promoting himself, along with other businesses in allied lines. After his graduation, again, more pictures downstairs, he somehow, maybe through the financing of the book, helped to finance it, but he traveled to England, and you'll see pictures of him there in very period dress, with a top hat and what have you. Europe, having been older, had developed, along with Germany, who he also visited, and became somewhat knowledgeable about things in the old world relating to his interest in electrical engineering, and of course being in having then moved to Buffalo from Dunkirk after he got back, was very much involved with Niagara Falls and the input of power from Niagara Falls to other locales in the area and or throughout the country and or Canada. I do know that he was a very entrepreneurial individual, doing consulting work in the Buffalo area after he moved here, had an office in one of the more prominent buildings downtown, as letters of his will indicate if you look through them. He began to become very interested in politics. At that time, there was no radio or television, so when he had a cause to support, he would stand on a corner and step up on a stool or what have you, and begin talking about the way things should be done. Boy, could we use them today. He'd gather people around and he'd start talking and what have things along that line about political issues. He was also a great champion for the little guy, and I think, as so many times happens, the gas company and subsequently the electric company, when electricity started coming in, and also the transportation, the trolleys and whatever have you, began petitioning the Buffalo City Council to allow them to raise their rates. Well, this kind of struck a nerve in Frank Perkins' soul, and he lobbied very heartily against the increases and gave the reasons, therefore, for not raising them, to a point where he would go to Buffalo City Council meetings and attempt and get the floor and rail against increases in those three areas that I mentioned. And sometimes the Buffalo City Councilman, in order to shut him up, would tell the Sergeant at Arms, "Get him out of here." Well, he'd be ushered out the door and go down the hall and come in a different entrance and begin his railing even louder. One of the answers to a question that Larry asked my mother, Marion, about her father, Frank C., she expounded on it a little bit and said that at some point he was asked to go to Washington, D.C. because of his expertise or whatever have you, but she's thoroughly convinced that the Buffalo City Council, through their connections in Washington, attempted to get him to move to Washington to get him out of their hair. Now, whether that is so, all I have to do is take my mother's word for it, and I'm not going to doubt that. But he continued to work and live in Buffalo, and at some point, I think it was in the teens, 1915, 16, whatever, ran for because of his interest in and complaining about, he ran for the Buffalo City Council and was elected. Now, there's also a story that even though he didn't join the Socialist Party, to our knowledge, he was supported by the socialist who, again, espoused the same theories that he had, that you shouldn't raise the rates, that people were being charged enough already, and whatever have you, fighting for the little guy, I guess. And whether on his run every couple years for the city council, or whether it was in 1927 when he ran for president of the city council, he was helped to be elected by a process called plunking. Now, I'll try to explain what plunking means. Plunking is a process by which, if 6 or 8 people or 10 people are running for 3 seats on a city council, or in this case, or whatever, and you're told to vote for 3, and the 3 that get the highest number of votes are elected to that position. Well, the Socialist Party promoted the idea of, instead of voting for 3, and if you vote for 3, you'd probably vote for the 3, best qualified or best advertised persons, you just vote for 1. In that way, and people did, they voted for Frank C. Perkins and didn't vote for the other 2. Well, that eliminated number 2 and number 3 vote for whomever might have come in second or third or whatever have you. So that is the process, and whether it's illegal at this time, I don't have any idea. There was some thought that doing it in that fashion would void, if you only voted for 1, it would void your vote. You had to vote for 3 or your vote wasn't counted. So whether that's been done away with or it's illegal, I don't have any idea. The previous to 1928, when he took office as president of the city council, I believe the city councilmen voted for their own president of the council, and then I think there was a change made, and a position on the ballot was president of the city council, at which time he ran for it and won. Now, whether the plunking occurred prior to or at that time, or on all occasions, I really don't know. But many of the newspaper articles downstairs will have information regarding that, as reported both in the Courier Express and the Buffalo News, and I think one other paper. I fed a lot of machines down at the Buffalo Public Library, a lot of dimes, to get copies of microfiches of articles in the paper around this time. And again, those are downstairs for anybody who might be interested in looking for them. Now, even though we're getting towards the end of the tape and it may stop momentarily, I'll keep on going until it stops and then flip it over to the other side. And because it's almost to the end, maybe I'll just let this run out and talk about my grandmother, Mary Jenny Pooley Perkins, on the other side.